Hi, I'm Philip J. Watt. Today we're going to talk about parapsychology and the psychic experience. We've got a very experienced researcher in this field. His name is Dean Radin. Now, Dean is the chief scientist at the Institute of Noetic Sciences in California. He has been a parapsychology or psychic experience researcher for close to 3 decades. And including working for the US government in classified programs into psychic research. He is a leader in the field. Part of his expertise is the experimentation on the fluidity of human consciousness, and with a focus on all general psychic experience and how that can be captured in the lab through various data sets. Welcome to the Rewriting Society series, Dean.
Thank you.
Okay, so as I understand it, science has been studying psi phenomena for around 130 years with some pretty impressive results. This data is considered statistically significant, especially through metadata analysis. And what that essentially means is that something is going on, but for some reason, it's still considered a pseudoscience. So we'll get to that a little bit later. But first, can you explain what the psychic experience is, or the psi phenomena, or as you prefer to call it, the supernormal experience?
Well, actually, I only call it supernormal because that's the title of a book that I wrote, but the neutral term for these experiences is psi. It's PSI, not as an acronym, but simply as a word. And the word is chosen as because it's the letter P in the Greek alphabet and stands pretty much for psyche. So it's about the mind. And the psychic phenomena are reported by the majority of the world's population. It's everything from unexplained gut feelings about something about an upcoming decision that's going to be made. Roughly 70 to 80% of people report that at one time or another, they're making a decision or approaching something that they have to do, and they get a bad feeling about it, oftentimes described as a visceral sensation because it is actually in the gut. That's how they feel it. And sometimes those come true. And so people say, well, their gut feelings led them to make a correct choice. But there are many other kinds of ways that these things will show up in everyday experience. Telephone telepathy is a term that's sometimes used when the phone rings and you know immediately who's calling without looking at the phone. There are people who have precognitive dreams. There are people who report that they can feel what's happening to a loved one at a distance. Occasionally you'll get people who say that they can't wear a watch, or they walk into a room because all of the electronics don't work. There's a wide range of these kinds of phenomena, and most of them are susceptible to be studied in a laboratory under controlled conditions. Because just because the people report these experiences doesn't mean that they're real. It could be coincidence, it could be made up, who knows what they are. But because they're reported throughout history and they're reported across cultures, it at least gives face validity that maybe something's going on. It is simply part of human experience. So that's where we go into the laboratory and see if we can determine what these experiences are. Are they chance, or are they something not chance in a controlled environment? So that's the kind of research that I do, and about 50 to 100 colleagues around the world also do.
Okay, so you mentioned gut feelings, or that feeling in your gut. We know that there's around 100 billion neurons or nerve cells in the cerebral brain, and also around 100 million neurons or nerve cells in the digestive tracts of the guts, and also around 40,000 nerve cells and neurons in the heart. Now, in the heart's obvious size compared to the big brain is very small, but when we look at the little brain, or the small brain, I think is what scientists call the gut brain, it's around 1% of the size of the cerebral brain. So do you think those neurons, those nerve cells, contain memory, contain feelings, and contribute to our experience of consciousness?
They may well, yes. I mean, we're talking here about, some people call it the belly brain, because of this tight nexus in the gut itself. And I suppose that it's controlling the process of digestion, which is extremely complicated, and offloads from the brain, so the brain doesn't have to think about it too much. Is it intelligent? Does it have its own consciousness? These are questions that we generally don't know. I can imagine that there may be something like a proto awareness. And, if it's running a digestive process, it needs to have feedback about what's going on. So it is in contact with the rest of the body. But as to intelligence and all the rest, we don't know. And the same can be said for the heart. Does it have its own center of awareness? We don't know.
Okay, so you say proto-awareness. Can you explain a little bit what that means? When you said that, I was thinking like an awareness a cell might have. So a cell needs to be aware of its environmental conditions. It responds to its environmental stimuli. It operates in accordance to what's happening on the outside. So it feels like there must be some type of awareness there. And does that awareness even go down into the atomic world, which we'll probably get into a little bit later as well?
Well, it's an interesting question about where awareness stops or where it begins. So you can just look at a thermostat on the wall and say that it's a feedback system. It has sensory inputs. It reacts to the world. And so is it aware? Well, most people would say, no, a thermostat is probably not aware, at least not in the way that we think of ourselves as being aware. But maybe all you need for awareness is something like a feedback system. And that's so we think of a proto-awareness or proto-consciousness as something which is in contact with the world, and there's a feedback loop to provide an information flow. Maybe that's all that's necessary. My guess is that it is not all that's necessary, but at this point we don't actually know for sure. The reason why it's an interesting question is because from a philosophical perspective, we look at things like panpsychism, which tries to figure out where do we draw the line where something has consciousness versus not. And it turns out it's very difficult to know where to draw the line. So we can look at something less complex than a human, like a cat or dog, and then ask the question, is this creature conscious? Do they have some kind of consciousness? 30 or 40 years ago, I think most people would have said no. But anybody who has a dog or a cat would immediately say yes. Clearly they're aware. So if that level is aware, what if you go down to a mouse? Well, a mouse is not that different, probably has some level of awareness, and so on. You can go all the way down to both living cells and maybe even to elementary particles, in which case there is awareness everywhere, all the way up and all the way down. So that's panpsychism. I suspect that something like that is probably correct.
Yeah, myself also. When we normally think of awareness, we're probably sort of thinking about self-awareness. And it's normally considered that not many other animals have self-awareness, although I would argue, based on my experience with my pets, that they had some degree of self-awareness. But there is that proto-consciousness or the step before that, which is just awareness itself. So it's definitely an interesting subject and a subject that really needs to be taken seriously in academia and scientific circles.
I think it is. I think there are more people who are seriously taking the possibility that awareness is fundamental in some way. I would probably not the majority opinion now, but it's a growing minority, I would say.
All right. I actually want to explore that a little bit later, but for the moment, I just wanted to talk about what the major experiments that have been studied in the parapsychological field. Okay,
well, for telepathy, there is one class of experiments called the Ganzfeld Telepathy Experiment. This uses a low-level sensory stimulus rather than sensory deprivation condition, and it pretty quickly will evoke a dream-like state in a person. So you imagine you have half of a ping pong ball over each eye, and you have a red light shining in your face, and you have headphones that are only playing white noise, and you're sitting in a comfortable chair, a reclining chair. after a few minutes in that condition with your eyes open, you basically become starved for stimulation, for any kind of information. And so it's easy to evoke dreamlike images. So if you put somebody in that condition and tell them to be sensitive to any kind of impressions that you're getting, you put somebody at a distance who is given a randomly selected picture and told, try to mentally put this picture in that other person's head, as in a telepathy connection. That experiment has been done over 4,000 times, that kind of protocol. And the overall data are very strong, suggesting that even unselected people, meaning usually college sophomores, that are doing the experiment for credit as opposed to saying that they think they're telepathic, overall is very strong statistical evidence that people select the correct picture, the one picture out of 4 possibilities, way more often than chance. These experiments are done in such a way that they exclude every known loophole in the design, so that there's no way that people can communicate by ordinary means. There's no way even that experimenters can produce fraudulent results. Much care has been taken in these experiments because they've been going for about 40 years now, and they, of course, attract a lot of skeptical criticisms, and over the years, the loopholes have been closed. So they're quite good results. So that's one class. Another class is saying, well, if what I just reported was conscious telepathy, it's somebody receiving impressions of some type and then making a decision about which target was sent. But there's an unconscious form of this experiment where you simply take 2 people, you tell them to keep each other in mind, you separate them, and you look at their brain responses while one of them gets a stimulus, like a light flash, and you see if the other brain lights up. So this is an EEG correlation experiment, which has also been done a number of times, including in functional MRIs. So in an MRI, you can tell not only whether there's a correlation, but where in the receiver's brain the effect shows up. So there are now, I think, 7 or 8 studies like that have been done in a functional MRI, and I think all except one actually showed a significant result, highly significant result. So the EEG correlation experiments work to some degree, the fMRI experiments work, and then a whole nother category where you take 2 people, you isolate them, and now you record autonomic physiology. So this is now things like skin conductance and heart rate and other forms of the autonomic nervous system. You have one think intently about the other and see if their physiology changes as a result of being thought at. And there too, we see correlations between one person's thoughts and intentions and the other person's body. So there are multiple experiments showing pretty much the same thing, that there is some form of connection between one person's mind and the other person's body, and vice versa. So something like telepathy, or if just for want of a better word, looks pretty much like it's real. It's consistent across several different classes. Then we have another category of clairvoyance and precognition. In clairvoyance, now sometimes known better as remote viewing, a typical experiment will be that you have 5 pictures, one of which is selected at random. Maybe it's shown on a computer screen in another room and there's nobody in that room. Your job then as the subject is to make a sketch of what you think the target is. And then later, that sketch and the 5 possible pictures, one of which is the real one and 4 decoys, are shown to judges, and the judges have to see if they can match your sketch against the correct one of those 5 targets. So that's a remote viewing experiment that's been done at this point maybe 1,500 times. And again, there the evidence is very strong that people can do that. And people who are talented can do it much better than people who are not so talented. So as in any domain of human experience, people have talent in these domains, and you see much more repeatable and robust effects for people with talent than people who don't have talent. Another category is precognition. It's similar to a remote viewing experiment, except that the target is selected after the person does their sketch. So there's no target at the time that they're making a sketch. They're basically trying to see their own future, and then that's how that works. And that gives basically the same result as a real-time experiment. Then there's a category of unconscious precognition tests, of which there are several classes now. And similar to a telepathy experiment where we're looking at how the body responds, in this case, we're looking at how the body responds before a stimulus occurs. And I call these presentiment experiments because they're pre-feeling. There's no cognition involved, it's feeling. Those, the meta-analysis, and by the way, all of these studies have meta-analyses done to see whether these effects are repeatable in independent labs, and they are. Presentiment effects look quite real. There's another couple of designs. There's one called implicit psi, which is a whole other class of precognition experiments. And then the other main category is psychokinesis, or mind-matter interaction effects. And so the target here is that you have your mind, you have a physical system at a distance, and you intend through your will to change some aspect of the remote target. And things have been used like electronic random number generators, which are like coin flipper machines, but they can flip coins very quickly. Sometimes actual coins, spinning coins, bubbles in water, heights of fountains, the behavior of small animals at a distance, a very wide range of targets. What I've been doing in the lab most recently is using optical systems to look at questions basically about the physics of mind-matter interaction. But within that category, there have been probably about 1,500 experiments. And again, the preponderance of the evidence across those studies suggests that there is some way that the mind can impress its will onto the world at large. So that's a brief overview of the different classes of experiments.
Well, you've just shown there, illustrated very clearly the science that is incorporated, the way that the scientific method is really incorporated into this field of study. Now, I mentioned before, and I think yourself too, some of the results, or a lot of the results, are statistically significant. And I also mentioned metadata analysis. Can you talk a little bit more about what that actually means, and maybe give some of the actual mathematical outcomes that really illustrate the deviation from chance?
Well, in the case of the Ganzfeld experiment, the odds against chance of ending up rather than 25%, which would be chance, because 25% comes from selecting one target correctly out of the 4 possibilities. So if that's a target and you don't know what the target is, and nobody knows what the target is, and you correctly select it, then obviously the chance is 1 in 4 that you'd be correct. What you see in these experiments with unselected volunteers is roughly 32% hit rate. The odds against chance of getting 32%, when 25% is chance after 4,000 and some sessions like this, is, I'm trying to think of the exact number now. I think it's 300 quadrillion to 1. It's 10 to the minus 30th probability. So that's a big, big number. And basically all that number means is this is absolutely not a chance effect. A number like that, an odds against chance number, means that you would need to run the same series of 4,000 experiments 300 trillion or 300 quadrillion times in order to get a result as good or better than the one that we actually saw. And to do that would take longer than the life of the universe, as far as we know. So we're not dealing with chance. But immediately you then have to ask, well, if it's not chance, well, what is it? And at this point, what we can say is we know a lot of things that it's not. We know that it's not due to randomization problems and picking the targets. We know it's not due to sensory leakage between the two people. We know it's not due to collusion. We know it's not due to fraud. We know it's not due to a long list of things. And each one of the things that I just mentioned is built into the protocol itself from the get-go to exclude those as possibilities. And this is basically part of the due diligence that is used in order to make sure that you're not fooling yourself when you do this kind of experiment. So you go through this exercise, and then you do a meta-analysis of all of the different experiments, not only to see that it's not a chance result, but can approximately the same result be seen when independent laboratories do it? And that this is really a core method in science and what makes science a powerful technique, that I can do an experiment in my lab and get an amazing result, but it's realistic that somebody else may not believe it because they could think, well, we made a mistake, or they're not reporting it correctly or something. So what counts in science is independent replication. So fortunately, in some classes of psi experiments now, like the Gansfeld case, we have at least 20 different laboratories that have done the same experiment, including skeptical laboratories, people where the investigators were explicitly denied the possibility that telepathy could exist. And they all get the same result, statistically speaking, and on average, 32%. So what we end up with is the protocols that are using standard scientific methods, the analysis is using standard statistics, using the same kinds of meta-analyses used in other disciplines. And you go through that whole exercise, you end up with comments from skeptics that basically say, we can't think of any plausible alternatives to telepathy as a hypothesis, but we're still not willing to accept it as telepathy. And the reason why they say that is not just because they're being coy. It's because we don't actually know what telepathy is yet. We know all the things that it isn't, but it's very difficult to say, well, it is this. And in order to know that it is definitely telepathy, we need to have a positive description of what it is, and that means a theory. And so at this point, we have probably a half a dozen theories, but none of them are really all that good yet. And what this tells us is, just as you see in the history of any form of science, it starts with observations. You then improve your measurements, which we do in the laboratory, and then oftentimes it could take a century or more before somebody comes up with an adequate explanation. So we are dealing here with what amounts to observable facts, which may be 20 years or 100 years ahead of science theory.
Do you think that's got something to do with the meta paradigm that we're currently under, called materialism or reductionist materialism?
I would say not so much materialism as mechanistic materialism. In other words, and I think you're right, that the reason why theories are difficult to promote at this point is because of a very strong assumption that consciousness is generated by the brain. So if it turns out, I mean, the reason why that comes about in the first place is because we see very tight correlations between brain activity and conscious thought and thoughts and emotions and everything else. But we may be making a mistake in terms of the arrow of causation. So if the arrow of causation does not go from brain to consciousness, or perhaps the other way around, or some other even stranger possibility, like the brain as a receiver of consciousness, which is the other possibility, then, of course, if you thought that the brain is everything there is to know about consciousness, and when you start talking about people who are separated, sharing an experience of some kind, it becomes very difficult to understand how that could be. Whereas if the opposite were true, and there's somehow consciousness permeating everything, and brains are receivers, then it's not so strange, because then you can imagine that you have the equivalent of two radio receivers that just happen to be on the same wavelength, and of course they're going to pick up the same signal.
Okay, that's you've touched on something I wanted to get on a bit later, so we'll go there now. The best analogy I've heard to describe that is, instead of the brain being a generator of consciousness, like an electricity generator creates electricity, it's more like, as you said, a tuner or a receiver of consciousness, much like a TV or a radio signal tunes into the electromagnetic, so the TV tunes into the electromagnetic signal that's being sent to it. And as we know, correlation doesn't cause, it doesn't mean causation. So just because we tamper with our brain doesn't mean it's actually tampering with consciousness itself. It may actually mean that it's tampering with the TV set and how that signal is actually received. So in that light, is there any scientific evidence that does suggest that the brain is a receiver and not a creator of consciousness?
Well, yeah, there's a lot of evidence, although we need to be careful that the term receiver or like a television receiver is more like a metaphor or an analogy. And we need to be careful not to get pulled too far along that direction. But the evidence that the arrow of causation may be wrong in terms of brain generating consciousness, uh, there's probably 8 or 9 different categories of evidence. So from one's perspective, you find phenomena like terminal lucidity. This is a phenomena that occurs when somebody is near death and may have had Alzheimer's or some kind of brain damage, or even in a coma. And the observable is that sometimes people who are very severely mentally disabled, moments before they die, are perfectly lucid. They will talk to people and then they're dead. Well, this kind of goes against the idea that the brain is generating that ability, because if the brain is so damaged that they're in a coma or not even able to talk, then what's happening? What happened to the brain that allowed them to suddenly become lucid just before they die? And then, of course, you have near-death experiences, and you have a whole range of experiences associated with at death or near death or slightly after death, suggesting that maybe the brain is not exactly what we thought it was. Most of that kind of evidence is anecdotal. It's observations that people make, but a lot of nurses and doctors will report these things in hospice situations. But that brings in the entire range of psi experiences, because if you can demonstrate telepathy in the lab, and you can demonstrate clairvoyance and precognition and all these other things, that begins to also suggest that there's at least some element of our awareness that is not limited to the ordinary senses. So it's not limited to like the bound of the body itself. And the one thing that makes all psychic experience strange is that all of it transcends space-time. It transcends ordinary space-time. So clairvoyance is somehow your mind transcending the limitations of space. And precognition is somehow your mind transcending the limitations of time, and so on. When you think of it in those terms, then how would the brain transcend itself in space-time? Well, it turns out that there is a possibility there. The possibility is that if the brain is operating as a quantum phenomenon, like a quantum biological effect, then most of it is here, just like any particle is mostly in one spot, but part of it is also wave-like, in which case it may actually spread out through space-time itself. And in that sense, be only kind of quasi-physical. Just like the wave function in quantum mechanics is kind of physical, but maybe not physical. We don't know what it is, but there's evidence that it's something. Well, maybe there's an aspect of the mind which is like that as well, but it would require more like a quantum metaphor for the brain. So either our conception of the brain as a classical physics mechanical object is wrong, or we need to extend it in terms of its physical description, or maybe the mind is something completely different. One of those.
And so you've touched on that area that we did a little bit earlier, which is the field of quantum physics. Now, it's, as I said, that's a discipline that you feel can scientifically account for the data being derived from these psychic experience studies. However, what I've found personally is a lot of confusion in cultural dialogue with friends online about how applicable quantum physics is to the classical physical, sort of manifested realm. Has consciousness been proven conclusively to impact physical systems? And if so, what interpretation of quantum theory, because as we know, there's quite a few interpretations of quantum theory, which interpretation might be most applicable for that?
Well, those are valid questions. Well, first of all, science is not in the business of proving anything. So all we can do is provide evidence, and then we have various interpretations of the evidence. So I would not say that quantum theory proves anything related to consciousness. The fact it doesn't prove anything other than it happens to be a fairly effective way of describing some aspects of the physical world. That said, you look at the perhaps the 12 or so different interpretations of quantum mechanics, and you ask people who are specialists in the foundations of quantum mechanics, trying to think of what kind of ontology does this theory present to the world. It turns out that there's very little agreement. Sometimes what you will get is very high certainty on the part of some physicists that they know what the answer is. But if you ask an audience of people, you will end up with almost the same number of people agreeing with each of the 12 different interpretations. So there's no overwhelming agreement, first of all. If you look at one of those classes, one class of interpretation says that something is necessary for the wave function to collapse. And this is the von Neumann interpretation. The reason why I pay attention to it is because partially it has a little bit of a door opening for how consciousness somehow interacts with the world. It's considered part of mainstream physics. Von Neumann was recognized by his peers at the time as a super genius. I mean, he's the one who put the mathematical foundations of quantum mechanics on paper in his famous book. So it's not something I would dismiss lightly. And he's not the only one, of course. You also have Eugene Wigner afterwards talking about consciousness as an important element. You have John Wheeler talking about the participatory universe. You have a lot of prominent physicists who have raised the possibility that there's something strange about consciousness, meaning specifically here awareness in the observation aspect of measurement. That seems to open the possibility that there's something about mind that interacts with matter. By the way, David Bohm had similar ideas. So from a philosophical perspective, you can argue this forever and never get any resolution. So the other approach that we've been taking is to look in the parapsychological literature, of which a large chunk of the studies looking at mind-matter interaction were specifically addressed towards the quantum measurement problem. And this is looking at the notion of, is there really something about consciousness that is affecting the material world or not? So we have 50 years of studies using random number generators. They show overall pretty good evidence that the mind is somehow interacting with the randomness. Well, the randomness in those cases, it can be traced back to quantum events. That's how these generators were designed. So it gives like a first pass way of informing the quantum measurement problem, saying, well, it does look like von Neumann may have been correct. There's something strange going on. In my own lab, for the past 7 or 8 years now, we've been looking at a double slit optical system because it's like the single best way of demonstrating quantum effects. And in particular, it's one of the best ways of showing the quantum measurement problem, because you can send a single photon through a double slit and it will behave like a wave or a particle depending on what you know about the behavior of the photon. So in our experiment, we test this notion that there's something about the mind that is related to the measurement problem by we've used both continuous lasers and also single photon versions of a double slit. And we ask people to imagine that they can get which path information as the photon goes through the two slits. That means to imagine in your mind's eye that you can see if the photon is going through the left slit or the right slit. And if you're able to actually do that, you're able to get the information. Getting information from a double slit system will force the photon to behave like a particle rather than a wave. If you don't get the information, then it behaves like a wave. So this then becomes something halfway in between a clairvoyance experiment and a psychokinetic experiment. Either you're trying to get information clairvoyantly or you're trying to push the photon through one slit versus the other. That would be psychokinetic. So we've done this experiment many times now. I forget, 15 or 16 experiments so far. And there too, the evidence is quite strong that when you ask people to do this, suddenly the interference pattern is not showing a wave-like pattern anymore. It's showing something much more akin to a particle pattern.
Now, there might not be 100% agreement or consensus that physical systems are impacted by consciousness, but there is some evidence to suggest that it is.
I see. If somebody was aware of all of the evidence the different classes of evidence suggesting that mind and matter interact, I think it would be difficult to avoid the conclusion that something is going on. Most people who are very skeptical are not interested in actually doing their homework because they've already made up their mind about what they believe, in which case then it's not even possible to have a debate because then there's nothing to talk about. So some of my colleagues will engage in debate to try to persuade people that there's really something going on. I usually don't bother to do that because it's a waste of time. My approach is to do experiments, to get them published in the best journals that I can get them published in, and basically let history decide. So I'm pretty well convinced, based on my own experiments, that there really are interactions that occur. It's actually more like correlations. We can measure, like any measurement is a correlation. We can see the correlations in the laboratory. So what I was mentioning before is that the reason why quantum mechanics is relevant to all this is because from a classical physics perspective, it's very difficult to imagine how mind and matter might interact because there's no opening for that possibility in classical mechanics. In quantum mechanics, there is an opening. And the primary reason is that like a big difference between classical and quantum mechanics is in classical mechanics, you can assume that all objects are separate, that things are really separate. They're separate objects. And whether somebody's observing or something or not doesn't make any difference. You can't make those assumptions in quantum mechanics anymore because quantum mechanics suggests that things are not as separate as they seem and that the nature of measurement or observation now becomes a critical component. That's a major difference between these two phenomena or two theories. So a large percentage of the research looking at mind-matter interaction is predicated on the notion that there's something peculiar about observation, as many of the founders of quantum mechanics had written about. That's why they were concerned about what is the ontology that quantum mechanics is trying to tell us if it looks like they're separate objects, but they're really not. And it looks like things are disconnected, but they remain connected in an entangled sense. And that observation or gaining knowledge from a system will change its behavior. Nothing like that exists in classical mechanics. So when you start doing experiments looking at these interactions, you find, as I have and my colleagues have around the world, somehow observation is changing the behavior of physical systems. Not just inanimate physical systems, but animate ones as well. So the telepathy experiments that we're talking about, some of them have to do with mind interacting with another person's body. Well, that's kind of a psychokinetic effect in that there's mind and there's matter, and somehow they're correlated with each other. So without going into great technical details in the experiments, I'm not sure how much more I could say about that.
So basically, throughout your studies, you've come to the conclusion that there is conclusive evidence that the physical systems are being impacted and that it deserves, appropriate attention and respect based on what the actual outcomes and data is.
I wouldn't want to push it too much. I would say that as in any other area of science where you have an empirical database, we're able to do a meta-analysis and show that the effects are repeatable in independent laboratories, that it should be put on the same playing ground as you would with any other kind of unexpected phenomenon. And in this case, it's not. It's not put on that playing ground. And the reason is that this kind of research is often confused with entertainment. That, we look at movies and see big things happening and assume, well, that's what's being studied in the laboratory. And of course, that's nonsense. The effects that we see in the lab are very small, but because we're able to use statistics and multiple measurements and so on, we're able to see very tiny effects with high confidence. No different than you would if you're doing an experiment in physics where you're measuring the charge on the electron. It's a really tiny thing, but you can measure it with high confidence. So the effects in general, the kinds of effects that we see in the lab tend to be pretty weak. We generally don't use people who are highly adept at these kinds of effects, oftentimes because it's very difficult to find people who actually are talented. They may not want to participate in these things. And also, maybe the phenomena are inherently unstable. If we're dealing with subtle effects of the human mind, it'd be a little bit like getting somebody who's known as being a composer, and then with glaring lights and a bunch of skeptical, grumpy people saying, now make a hit, do it, go. Why are you not doing it yet? Have you finished yet? Some kinds of human performance just don't work very well under those conditions. This may be one of those kinds of examples.
And you mentioned that the mainstream view, or what I like to call the mainstream view, because they seem to have a lot of, I guess, self-love for the paradigm structures they operate in, and it really comes across as sort of a closed-minded arrogance, and not just this particular discipline, but across many academic and scientific disciplines around the world. So why do you think they are so closed off, or just reject and explain away this data? And are they justifiable to do so? What's their justification for it?
Well, on the positive side, one of the values of science and the academic process in general is skepticism. I mean, it prevents people from falling down the wrong holes, basically. And so skepticism is very important to sharpen exactly what it is that people are talking about. The other thing is about the academic world that is basically, it's an ideological domain. It's all about ideas. And so if somebody builds their career based on an idea, and they get promoted and they get recognized and so on, they're going to defend that idea as though their life was at stake, because in some respects it is. That's their life, is the idea. So another reason is, and this, by the way, is not just for the kind of controversial work that I do, but any idea. If you look in journals in any discipline, you find people screaming at each other all the time about things that a non-academic won't even know what are you even screaming about? They're things that are subtle from our perspective. So it's not too surprising that you get this kind of resistance in the academic world. And as I said, it's not really a bad thing. It only becomes bad when it reaches a level of prejudice, and it becomes impossible then to even publish these kinds of experimental research in mainstream journals, because the publishers say things, and I've seen this repeatedly. We'll submit something to a journal, and the editor will say, "Oh, this looks really interesting, but I don't think I'm going to publish it." Well, why not? And one of the answers I got was that it would bewilder the readers of the journal that such a thing was published. To which I'm thinking, are you kidding? It would bewilder the readers to have something of that sort published, even though there's nothing wrong with it. To use like the same methods used in every other article that's published in the journal, except that it's talking about something which is a little bit strange. So if readers are so bewildered and shocked that easily, that's not a good thing. That's not a good aspect of the posturing that has to take place within an ideological constraint, which is not only academia, it's true in politics and everywhere else. So one of my interests and reasons that I continue to do this kind of research is not only curiosity about the phenomena, but a kind of a fascination about the sociology of science. When I was going through education, I never even heard anybody talking about that science had a sociology about it. But of course it does. It's a human enterprise. And like any other human enterprise, there are politics, there's jealousy, there's vain behavior, there's every form of human foible that you can imagine that is part of the mix. At least there's the aspiration that people are going to be rational about evaluation of evidence. But I've seen so many cases where people are not acting rationally that I think it's just fascinating to watch it.
Well, you brought up something that is actually something that is discussed in sort of my circles where I write and who I speak to, and that is the scientism or the dogma or the assumptions, or as you say, the politics that happens in the scientific field. And you know, it's normally assumed in society, mainstream sort of consciousness, that science is this objective, rational, you know, unbiased, you know, operating procedure that is, you know, a sort of modern day savior. It's like it's a rationalism that is above all else, and it's kicking religion's ass and all these things. But as you say, it's a human enterprise, and it really does have the negative and positive quality that come along with any human enterprise. This is such an important area that I really think that needs to be put on the table for society, because and it obviously it has been through, you know, people like yourself and Rupert Sheldrake and Graham Hancock and many others who are actually calling out the discipline for their biased and dogmatic behaviours. So if general society can begin to start talking about it too, maybe you know, they wouldn't feel so chuffed in sort of maintaining the status quo that they fight vehemently to achieve. So,
well, I hope that you're right, but of course the history shows that bureaucracies at some point exist only to sustain themselves, and so it'd be very, very unusual for an existing academic site to change too radically, too fast. So I think what may happen if academia keeps going the way it's been going for the last 500 years or so, what's more likely to happen is that new generations will come along with slightly new ideas, and so it'll slowly evolve towards a greater openness to these kinds of phenomena, not so much because the evidence is getting better, although it is, but more so because if you kind of look at like a meta level of the worldview that science is creating, it's becoming slowly more and more open to the idea of quantum biology, and maybe it's not quantum, but there are strange things that occur in the mind. Some of this coming out of the research now in meditation. So the reason why my last book was Super Normal, and it was all about advanced practices associated with meditation, that whole tradition leads exactly into psychic phenomena. And that was the point of writing about it, that we're on the verge now it's okay in the academic world to study meditation. Well, what happens when we started studying advanced meditators? People who regularly experience these kinds of things. That will slowly start changing the taboo that prevents this from being openly discussed in the academic world.
yeah, it's not a new train of thought, is it? The many ancient spiritual traditions and even some of the modern ones have talked about the primary role that consciousness plays in reality. And I find myself, you know, as a spiritual person, but also very much based in logic and rational thought, because I want to activate both sides of myself, that dual side of myself. I want to feel it and I want to understand it at the same time. So I get really excited when I hear different types of scientific endeavour that has uncovered some of this ancient wisdom that really needs to be redesigned and reincorporated into our society for our future, because we have a lot of issues in society, and a lot of it is due to materialistic and individualistic sort of paradigms that we operate under, that sort of generate greed and generate selfishness and generate competition and generate all these things that are opposed to what our fundamental nature actually is, and that is, you know, that we are connected to everything and that we're connected to everything else, including every other person. So actually I might go into another question on that at that point. So I heard in a video that you mentioned that those who want to take a positive shift in their consciousness turn out to be a better person for themselves and most probably for those around them due to that positive shift. And it seems to me I'm a little bit more optimistic than you. I don't want to, as that one of the famous quotes by, I can't remember who said it, but this is paraphrased. It takes people to die to transcend these sorts of paradigms. So, and that's what you're alluding to in your previous comment. But I'm hopeful that, and we've got the new generations coming through. They're more connected. There's more information. The internet is instantaneous. They're evolving much quicker than their previous generations. Maybe not all of them, but some of them. The access to information that they've got is incredible. It's unprecedented. So that may just be that quantum leap that we need to really start bringing reality into these mainstream ideas and paradigms that sort of permeate our culture and our collective consciousness and the dialogue that culture and society engages in. So if the scientific establishment officially opened the door to parapsychological studies and took the data seriously, like they should, to be considered truly scientific, let's not forget that, you know, that the denial of this sort of information is unscientific. And if the society actually knew this and understood this, I think they would be pretty upset, because they've got this idea in their head that science is unbiased and real and rational. So it would change.
Chunks of it are. I mean, I think we don't have too much science bashing here, because to a large extent, I would say that the aspiration of science certainly is that it is rational. And a lot of it behaves in that way. It's just that when you start pushing against existing paradigms, then it's no longer quite as rational.
Right, yeah. So I was pointing out the negative aspects there as well. Of course, it's a beautiful study, and it's brought so much, you know, knowledge and information to our world, and it's helped us through technology and helped us to alleviate particular types of suffering for society and whatnot. So of course, it's a brilliant area and a much needed, I guess, discipline in our modern day era. But it's still responsible for all of its actions, and we need, as a society, we need to open a dialogue as to what's good and what's not. I think that's really important. What are these positive effects that you have witnessed in those individuals, and how do you think that would actually translate into society?
Well, we see in people who have near-death experiences and other kinds of noetic awakenings that generally they become more loving people, more interested in service. They, in almost every dimension you can think of in terms of their personality, they improve. Now, this is not uniformly the case, because sometimes somebody will have a transformative experience and they become obsessed with it, and they go a little bit crazy. They can become psychotic. Well, that's a small percentage. It's almost the same percentage of people who start to meditate and will go crazy because they're just not appropriate for them. But the majority will change into better people in almost every way you can think about it. So there's but that requires a transformative experience. You know, you don't want to have everybody experience a near-death experience. That's a little bit too radical. Similar experiences, of course, are reported all the time, like mystical experiences of walking down the beach one day. It will just happen. Usually it happens with preparation. The person's meditating, they're in a crisis, something happens to spark it. But that's difficult to create on demand. So I don't think we don't want to wait for that. Another way of thinking about this is a transformation of society itself. And you'll occasionally see something like that with our great leaders. So an example in the United States, for example, is someone like Martin Luther King, who is able to take pressure from society and channel it in just the right way to make a huge change in the way the civil rights are treated in the United States. And there are examples in every country of people who became the lightning rod for something that there was pressure in society to produce, a change. So that's one way. Another way occasionally is done by a book. Sometimes books will do that. Sometimes a movie will do that. It'll start a whole dialogue about something. Science can do that as well. So science has done that in the past, and we're seeing it very slowly happening as a result of people thinking about the difference between classical and quantum mechanics. It provides a very different worldview for what kind of a world we live in. All of the interpretations are not worked out, obviously, But when we do begin to settle in on an interpretation that people can agree upon, it's going to have a huge effect on people, because it probably will show us that the world that we thought we were living in is not exactly all there is. But that takes quite a lot of time. I mean, it really does take generations, because the older you get, the more difficult it is to adopt new ideas, because you have to reconfigure your own sense of self. That's why progress progresses by funerals. It's and so from a personal point of view, your lifetime seems like a long time. From a cosmic point of view, it's nothing. So if we're talking about a transition that might take 10 generations, that seems like forever, but that's nothing. And even from just the geological time on the planet, it's nothing. So we're all used now to fairly fast changes in technology in our own lifetime. And our founder of the institute where I work, the Institute of Noetic Sciences, is Edgar Mitchell, who's the sixth man to step on the moon. And what he likes to say is his grandparents moved across the country in a wagon train. And his parents used the car, and he went to the moon. I mean, that's 2 generations, basically, from a wagon train to going to the moon. And so we're kind of used to that level of fast change in some aspects of our lives. But when it comes to what amounts to worldview changes, it's a little bit slower. Because we don't live our individual lives with these massive changes in ideas unless they're thrust upon us by something like climate change, which has made everything go haywire, and then it is brought more personally to each individual. But as we see, probably in every country, there are people who are saying, no, that it's all a hoax. There's nothing going on. But these are the people who are going to get drawn up into a tornado that's going to show up one day on their doorstep, while they're continuing to deny that anything is happening. It's just part of human nature to be slow about these things.
Well, I hope it sort of synchronizes with that fast-changing technology and information sharing and the digital age. I hope it's a symbol that we can sort of change our mindsets within a generation or two. Now, I wanted to touch on something about. I read in one of your videos. I saw that you mentioned that there was some studies done on sort of quantum theorists, and the majority actually believe that consciousness does play a role in quantum theory and its impacts on the physical realm. So, why hasn't the orthodoxy recognized that?
Well, what I was saying probably in that video is that the original orthodoxy, meaning the founders of quantum mechanics, all thought and wrote deeply about this issue of how do we extract consciousness out of physics, because they don't want it in physics. I mean, physicists like to think about the outside world. It's the world out there that we're studying, and it doesn't matter if you observe it. But the founders of quantum mechanics immediately knew that they were onto something new. So the irony here is that the orthodoxy, meaning the founders, we're now into post-orthodoxy. It's a new generation of physicists, many of whom don't think about these issues, so they don't really know about it. But for people who do think about foundational questions, probably the majority still don't think that consciousness has anything to do about it, because they in a sense, it makes physics much less hard. It's not a hard science anymore. If you need to bring in the consciousness of the observer, it becomes much more difficult to think about. And so I know a lot of physicists, and I know that they're not very happy with the idea that consciousness is involved with it. On the other hand, I know physicists who have gone into the study of the foundations of quantum mechanics, and they come out of it thinking there's no way to get rid of consciousness. So I'm thinking of a book written by 2 physicists, and it's called Quantum Enigma, which is a great book to read if you want to know from a mainstream physics perspective, having nothing to do with parapsychology or psychic anything. How do you extract the notion of consciousness from the physical world, given quantum mechanics? And the answer is you can't. So it's an unpopular view. It's a minority view today in physics. But that's why the experiments that we're doing in the laboratory is looking at this not from an argumentative perspective, but from one where we provide empirical data. So we're trying to inform the question about the quantum measurement problem with data and to see what happens when you do an experiment of this type. So that's the approach we're taking, and it's partially because I don't really have the mind of a theorist, and I'm not a philosopher. I'm an empiricist. So the way I approach problems is testing it.
All right, so I wanted just to quickly talk about the Global Consciousness Project. It's an experiment that tests whether there are correlations between global events that capture the collective consciousness of humanity and the 70 random number generators that are placed strategically around the Earth. Can you talk a little bit more about this project and provide some of the real iconic examples that appear to illustrate a connection between what's happening in the mindset of humanity and what's happening in the data of these physical systems?
Well, first of all, this line of research mainly started with Roger Nelson, who was one of the members of the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Laboratory. I met Roger when I was at Princeton. I was in the psychology department. He was in the engineering department. And the concept was that for something like 40 years, people have been using random number generators, these little individual electronic circuits to generate random events, as a target for mind-matter interaction. And part of the idea of using that is that they're coming from a quantum source. And so if the mind is involved with quantum measurement at all, it may be possible to basically take a whole bunch of random bits going along and mentally cause more ones to show up than more zeros, something as simple as that. So those experiments suggest that people can do that there's a relationship between your mind and what happens in the physical world. Well, Roger had this idea that those studies all have to do with intention, like what you want to happen. And maybe intention's only part of the issue. Maybe attention is also important. So if you simply put your attention on a random system, maybe it doesn't behave so randomly anymore. It starts behaving in a more patterned form. In all cases, it assumes that not only are the objects not separate, like me and a random number generator are not really that separate, but also that mind and matter are not that separate. The metaphor I use here is a Mobius strip. So Mobius strip, it looks like a regular strip of tape, but you twist one side and then you connect it back up. So this is a topological anomaly because if you start tracing along one side of the Mobius strip, you'll go all the way around it on both sides and end up in the same place. There's only one side to this strip. So it looks like two things, two sides from a distance, but it's really not. So something like that. Maybe mind and matter are complementary in that form. So Roger's idea was you take random number generators and put it into the vicinity of a group that is meditating or a chorus or a sports team or something where people have to do something as a group attention, to see whether during the group effort, when people feel some kind of a flow, they get into a flow state, and people can feel this inside. It's these cases like you see a sports team that is doing way better than they usually do. They're just like, they can do no wrong. And you then talk to people afterwards and say, well, did something unusual happen there? And they'll all say, yeah, like it was amazing. Something happens during that case where the hypothesis is in this experiment is that if you had random number generators running in that kind of a group, that it would no longer be quite so random. That the attention of the group would somehow cause the randomness to cohere and become non-random. So we did, between Roger and I, we probably did 100 experiments looking at the effects of random number generators in groups. We kept seeing that there are interesting results. So Roger had the idea of let's make this worldwide so that we don't have to, on the fly, put an experiment together, but we'll have it running all the time. And then we can take advantage of unexpected events like earthquakes and terrorist acts. So in 1998, I believe, Roger started putting the network together, and today it's going now over 15 years. We have 65 to 70 random generators in major cities around the world. And What Roger does is either he or somebody will send him a message saying there's something coming up. There's a big meditation, there's some event, some sports thing, something is happening. Use this as an event where we can predict there'll be a lot of attention paid during this event. And the way with media is now, you could have easily close to 1 billion people all paying attention to the same thing at the same time. So he sets up in advance that for a given length of time, like the opening ceremony of the Olympics, for example, is a good event. Lots of people are watching it. It's something that is coherent in the sense that everyone is watching with the same expectation, the same form of attention, as opposed to watching the World Cup. So in the World Cup, you might have 1 billion people watching, but you have their split attention. Some want this team to win, some that want, so they're not really coherent. Whereas the opening ceremony of the Olympics is coherent. And you know that the ceremony is 3 hours, so you'll say, oh, well, our standard method is we take the length of the time of the event, we'll go 1 hour before and 1 hour afterwards. So we might have a 5-hour event. But the prediction is that during those 5 hours that all of the random generators in the world will stop behaving randomly. They'll behave more orderly. And there's a standardized method that is used now to do this analysis. So it's all planned in advance. And then you do the analysis when it's finished and you see what you get. So at this point, there's something like 450 events of this type that have been done. Everything from 9/11, when that terrorist act occurred, to lots of earthquakes, to all kinds of big events around the world. And on average, it shows that there is a deviation in the random generators in the direction of becoming more orderly. And the overall result is now over 7 sigma. A 6 sigma event is 1,000,000,000 to 1 odds against chance. We're at 7 sigma, which I don't know what it is, 100 trillion or something beyond that. It's an extremely unlikely event by chance. And what's important to say in this experiment is some people think that you have randomness going and you look for strange things in the randomness. And then you say, oh, well, that must have been this event. That, of course, is not what we do, because you can find patterns in randomness easily. We have an event, we define it before the data is looked at, we have a standard analysis, and you have an outcome. So there's no selection of any type. With that as the database now, and by the way, all of the data is publicly available. You can go to the website, download the whole thing. It's way over 100 gigabytes at this point, but you can get it if you want. And so we encourage people who either are skeptical or maybe they're interested in this kind of result to go into the data, pull out data from given days, see if they can replicate the result that we found, or look at the data in new ways. There's many ways you can look at this data. Most of it, by the way, I think way over 90% of the data is chance. I mean, there's nothing happening worldwide. And so the vast majority of this database is what amounts to a control. It's just random data coming in all the time. And only a very tiny percentage of it are these 450 events. So the website there is global-mind.org. And that'll bring you to the website where it's a huge amount of information about this project and interpretations of it and so on.
Excellent. All right, so we've covered a lot today. Is there anything else that you want to add? Or when it comes to social dialogue, is there something, the particular topics that we should really be discussing as a society that you really that you think should be a part of our focus?
Well, I would say that one of the reasons why it's important to study consciousness and its capacities is because the prevailing view is from the neurosciences. And the neurosciences they say basically that we're a machine made of meat, which is a mechanistic view of the mind and the body. And that view very rapidly leads to a nihilistic sense, that everything is pointless, there's no purpose for anything. And I see this in younger people who are in neuroscience curriculums or even just a general curriculum where they're taking some neuroscience. You come away with that idea of, if I'm just a robot, and even neuroscience still talk about the possibility that we're really just zombies. You know, we have the illusion of consciousness. I don't know who is having the illusion, but somehow we're robots who think we're aware somehow. If you live under because we are creatures that need meaning. Meaning is important to us for our own self-definition and why we do anything. If you are taught what amounts to a hypothesis at this point, that we're machines made of meat, that can easily lead people, especially younger people, into very serious bouts of depression. Because why bother doing anything? So one answer to that is, well, if that's really true, if science is true in this case, well, we need to learn how to live with it. Virtue is its own reward. You treat other people nicely because that's how you want to be treated. And maybe we are machines made out of meat. But if the assumption is not true, if there's something that's been missed by science because of the taboo, and because people fear things that they don't understand very well, and because some of this begins to sound like old superstitions, it sounds like religion, and so from a modern perspective, we start to stiff-arm that because it doesn't even sound rational anymore. But nevertheless, maybe some of that ancient wisdom was not so crazy after all. And so we need to be careful about not throwing out the baby with the bathwater, as we say, and to reevaluate what of the old wisdom is worth keeping. And there's certainly parts of old wisdom that we can throw away. Some of it is superstition. But we need to have a better sense of sifting what can we learn from the ancients that we may have overlooked today. And it's not clear to me at all that if we decide at some point that consciousness is fundamental in some way, it simply exists out there like air exists, it's in the background somehow. I don't know exactly why that would say that suddenly it's not nihilistic anymore, with one proviso, and that is that if we live in a holistic environment where things really are connected, way more interconnected than simply ecological, or like mentally connected, maybe that does provide a different sense of who and what we are. So now we can start talking about the humanity of all of us, right? An individual and everyone is the same at some level, in which case things like the golden rule suddenly make a lot of sense. It becomes much more difficult to ignore somebody else's suffering. That said, it will take a long time for people to change their behavior because our whole structure of civilization is not based on where our laws, the way we behave, everything assumes that we are individual and separate. And that's what we usually experience as well. Some of that may not be true. So that's why I think it's important to have consciousness studied in every possible direction you can imagine to figure out what is actually going on here.
Well, what you just described there is what I would consider a spiritual experience or a spiritual philosophy of life. But I don't look at it as something beyond our scope of rationalism. It's an experience. It's a feeling. It's an understanding of that connectedness with everyone around us. And once we start to look at it like that, and not make it so esoteric and so ununderstandable, it really is just a beautiful experience.